The bucket of dirty water tipped over, and Mira Voss barely caught it before it soaked the floor she had just finished scrubbing. Her hands were raw from the cold stone. Her knees ached. Outside the kitchen window, the horns were already sounding across the valley, calling every soul in Ashveil to the courtyard before the sun reached its highest point. She did not have time to be tired. Tribute day did not wait for tired girls. "Mira, move faster, girl, the cook needs that water for the pots." Elena Marsh's voice cracked through the kitchen like a whip, though there was no real anger in it, only exhaustion. Elena had run this kitchen for 20 years, and in all that time, she had never once let herself grow soft toward anyone, least of all a servant girl with no pack and no name that mattered. Mira dragged the bucket to the stove without answering. Answering back only made the day longer. She was 17, though nobody had ever thrown her a birthday, and she had lived in Ashveil's servant quarters for as long as she could remember. She had no wolf, no pack mark on her skin that anyone could see, no family beyond a mother who had died coughing blood into a rag 6 winters ago, whispering words Mira never understood, about a debt not yet paid and a name not yet spoken. Since then, Mira had scrubbed floors, hauled water, and made herself as small as the walls would allow. Being invisible was safer. She had learned that a long time ago. The one thing she could never make invisible was the mark on her left wrist, a shape like a crescent moon wrapped in thorns, dark as a bruise, permanent as bone. She kept it hidden under a long-sleeve summer and winter both, because marks like that drew attention, and attention drew trouble, and trouble was the last thing a girl with no pack could afford. "They're gathering the whole valley for this one," said Lucy, another kitchen girl, younger than Mira by 2 years and twice as talkative. She balanced a tray of bread rolls on her hip and peered out through the narrow window at the courtyard filling with bodies. "I heard the Alpha King himself is coming. Not just his men, him." Mira kept her eyes on the pot in front of her. "The Alpha King comes every autumn for tribute." "That's nothing new. Not with Baelor, though. They're saying he's bringing Baelor this time." At that name, even Elena paused, wooden spoon frozen halfway to the pot. Mira had heard the stories, same as everyone in Ashveil had heard the stories. Baelor was not simply a wolf. He was something older, something the histories barely explained properly, a war beast bonded to the Draven bloodline for longer than anyone alive could remember. Some said he was born from the mountains themselves. Some said he had fought in wars 3 generations back, and outlived every soldier who stood beside him. What everyone agreed on was this: Baelor answered to exactly one person in the entire world, and that person was Kael Draven, Alpha King of the Northern Packs. Baelor did not bow. Baelor did not accept touch from strangers. A noble's son had once reached out to stroke his fur during a visit to the capital, and the noble's son had lost 2 fingers for the mistake. "They're bringing that thing here?" Lucy's voice dropped low, half thrilled and half afraid. "Then stay out of the courtyard when the ceremony starts," Elena said sharply, and went back to stirring. Mira wished she had that option, but every servant in Ashveil was required to kneel in the courtyard during tribute, servants included, so that the visiting Alpha King could see the full obedience of the pack he ruled over. It did not matter that nobody would look twice at a girl scrubbing floors. Presence was required. Presence was not the same as being seen. By midday, the entire courtyard of Ashveil Hall stood packed shoulder to shoulder, warriors in their finest leather, nobles in furs dyed with colors Mira had never been able to afford even in imagination, elders at the front, their faces carved from decades of quiet authority, and at the very back, near the servants' entrance, the invisible ones, the cooks, the stable hands, the girl with dirt still under her fingernails from the morning's work. Mira knelt where she always knelt, near the wall, half hidden behind 2 broader servants so that she would not stand out even by accident. Her sleeve was pulled down over her wrist out of habit rather than thought. Her head stayed low. The gates opened. Kael Draven entered on foot, not on horseback, which the older servants whispered was unusual for him. He was tall, in the particular way that made people stop talking when he passed, not because of any effort on his part, but because power like that did not need to announce itself. His hair was dark, his eyes a shade of gray that seemed to measure everything they landed on. He wore no crown, no ceremonial jewels. He did not need them. Beside him walked Baelor. The stories, Mira realized instantly, had not exaggerated. Baelor was massive, larger than any wolf had a right to be, his fur a deep, storm-colored gray, streaked with old white scars that told histories no one alive could read anymore. His eyes held something almost unbearably old, patient in the way mountains are patient, waiting out empires without moving an inch. The courtyard bowed as one, heads dropped, breaths held. Kale Draven walked the center aisle toward the raised platform, where Ashveil's pack leader waited to receive him, Baelor pacing silently beside him, exactly where he always walked, exactly where tradition said he belonged. Then Baelor stopped. At first, nobody noticed. Kale took 2 more steps before he realized his beast was no longer beside him, and when he turned back, his expression shifted from mild confusion into something far more careful. Baelor's head had turned toward the back wall of the courtyard, toward the servants, toward the row where Mira knelt, half hidden, trying to be smaller than the space she occupied. The great beast's nose lifted. He inhaled once, long and deliberate, the way a creature does when it recognizes something it has been waiting its whole life to recognize. Mira felt it before she understood it, a pull in her chest, sudden and strange, like a string tightening from somewhere behind her ribs. Her wrist burned beneath her sleeve, a heat she had never felt from the mark before, not once in 17 years. She did not lift her head. She prayed, silently and uselessly, that whatever was happening had nothing to do with her. It did not work. Baelor moved. He crossed the courtyard in long, unhurried strides, and the crowd parted for him the way water parts for a blade, nobles and warriors alike, stumbling backward to clear his path, none of them daring to speak, none of them daring to reach for a weapon against a creature that had never once needed correcting in 30 years of service. He stopped directly in front of Mira. For one endless moment, nothing happened. The whole courtyard seemed to forget how breathing worked. Mira lifted her eyes slowly, against every instinct that told her to keep them down, and found herself staring into the ancient gray gaze of the most feared beast in the northern packs. Baelor lowered himself to the ground. His front legs folded first, then his massive head, until his entire body rested low before her, his forehead nearly touching the stone at her knees. It was not a posture of threat. It was not a posture of curiosity. It was, unmistakably, impossibly, a bow. The silence that followed was not the silence of a quiet room. It was the silence of 300 people simultaneously realizing they had witnessed something the world had no proper word for. Mira did not move. She could not move. Her hands were pressed flat against the cold stone, her heart slamming so loudly she was certain the beast in front of her could hear it. Somewhere near the platform, a voice broke the silence at last, low and controlled, in a way that told Mira the man speaking was working very hard to sound calm. Baelor. Kale Draven's voice carried across the courtyard without needing to be raised. Stand down. Baelor did not move. Baelor. A second time, sharper now, an order rather than a request, the kind of command that had never in living memory gone unanswered. The beast remained exactly where he was, head bowed before a servant girl in a patched dress, as if the alpha king of the northern packs had not spoken at all. Every eye in the courtyard turned from the beast to the girl to the king and back again, a slow, spreading wave of disbelief. Elena, somewhere near the kitchen entrance, had gone completely still, a tray forgotten in her hands. Lucy's mouth hung open. Even the elders on the platform, men who had spent lifetimes maintaining perfect composure, had lost every trace of it. Mira felt the weight of every stare land on her at once, and for the first time in her entire life, she understood with total certainty that she would never again be invisible. She should have felt relief. Some small, foolish part of her had spent years wishing to be noticed, to be more than the girl who scrubbed floors and carried water and disappeared into corners. But relief was not what moved through her now. What moved through her now was dread, cold and absolute, because she recognized the shape of what was happening, even if she could not yet name it. Her mother's last whispered words rose unbidden in her memory, a debt not yet paid, a name not yet spoken. Whatever this was, it had been waiting for her a very long time, and it had chosen this courtyard, in front of the entire pack, to finally arrive. Cale Draven descended from the platform. He walked the length of the courtyard the way Baelor had, except slower, his gray eyes fixed on the girl kneeling with his beast bowed before her, an expression on his face that Mira could not read and did not want to try. He stopped an arm's length away. "What is your name?" he asked. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. Mira Voss. Cale Draven looked down at his beast, still bowed low, still refusing every order given to him for the first time in 30 years. And then he looked back at the girl, at the sleeve pulled tight over her wrist, at the fear written plainly across her face. "Baelor has never done this," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Not once, not for anyone." Mira said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make the courtyard stop staring, nothing that would make the beast rise, nothing that would return her to the safety of being nobody in particular. The entire pack remained silent, waiting for an explanation that even their king did not have. Nobody in the courtyard moved for a long time after that. Cale Draven finally straightened and turned toward the elders on the platform, and something in his posture made the entire crowd realize the tribute ceremony was not going to continue as planned. "Clear the courtyard," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silence. "Tribute will resume tomorrow." Nobody argued with an alpha king. The crowd began to disperse in confused clusters, whispering behind raised hands, throwing glances back at the servant girl still kneeling beside a beast that refused every command given to him. Elena pushed through the thinning crowd and reached Mira's side before the guards did, gripping her arm as if she could shield her simply by standing close enough. "What did you do?" Elena whispered, though there was no accusation in it, only fear. "Nothing," Mira said, and it was the truth, though the truth did not seem to matter anymore. Baelor finally lifted his head, slow and deliberate, and rose to his full height beside her, close enough that Mira could feel the heat radiating from his massive body. He did not growl. He did not show his teeth. He simply stood there, positioned like a wall between Mira and the rest of the courtyard, and Mira understood, with a chill crawling up her spine, that the beast had appointed himself her protector, without asking anyone's permission, least of all hers. Cale Draven approached again, and this time 2 of his personal guard flanked him, hands resting near their weapons, though nobody dared draw one near Baelor. "You will come with me," he said to Mira. It was not phrased as a question, but there was something in his tone that softened it slightly, an acknowledgement that she had done nothing wrong even as the consequences of the day landed on her regardless. "Where?" Mira's voice cracked, despite every effort to keep it steady. "To the council chamber. There are questions that need answers, and I suspect you have as few of them as I do." Elena's grip tightened. She has done her work faithfully for 6 years. She has never caused trouble. Whatever this creature is doing, it has nothing to do with her character. "I am not accusing her of anything," Cale said, and though his voice remained even, something flickered behind his gray eyes, something that looked almost like sympathy. "But a war beast bonded to my bloodline for 3 decades does not break tradition without reason. I intend to find that reason before anyone decides to punish a girl for a mystery she did not create." That last part was aimed, Mira realized, at the elders still standing on the platform, several of whom wore expressions that had already curdled into something far less patient than curiosity. She rose on unsteady legs, Baelor rising with her, matching her pace step for step as the guards led her toward the council hall at the center of Ashveil's compound. Lucy watched from the kitchen doorway, her face pale, mouthing something Mira could not make out. Elena followed as far as the guards allowed before being turned away at the chamber doors, though not before pressing a small cloth-wrapped bundle into Mira's hand. "Bread," Elena whispered. "You don't know how long they'll keep you." The council chamber was colder than the courtyard had been, all stone and shadow, with a long table where Ashveil's elders sat in a row like judges preparing a verdict. Edwin, the eldest among them, a man whose face seemed permanently arranged into disapproval, leaned forward the moment Mira entered. "This is highly irregular," he said, before anyone else could speak. "A servant girl causing a war beast to abandon 30 years of discipline is not a small matter, Alpha King. I would remind you that irregularities of this kind have historically indicated nothing you have proof of yet," Kale interrupted, taking a seat at the head of the table without waiting for permission. Baelor settled at Mira's side, refusing to be more than an arm's length from her, and the elders eyed him the way a person eyes a loaded weapon left unattended in a room. "Sit," Kale said to Mira, gesturing toward an empty chair near the foot of the table. She sat, feeling every eye in the room measuring her, weighing her, deciding what category of threat she might represent. "Tell me about your mother," Kale said. Mira's hands tightened around the bundle of bread in her lap. "She died when I was 11. She worked in the kitchens here, same as I do now." "Where did she come from?" "Before Ashveil." "I don't know. She never spoke about it. She said Ashveil was where we belonged, and that was the end of every conversation about it." Edwin's eyes narrowed. Convenient that a woman with no history produces a child capable of commanding a war beast without lifting a finger. "I did not command him," Mira said, sharper than she intended, her fear finally cracking into something closer to anger. "I did nothing. I was kneeling exactly where I am told to kneel every single tribute day of my life." "And yet," Edwin said, "here we are." Kale raised a hand slightly, and Edwin fell silent, though his expression suggested the silence cost him considerable effort. "What was your mother's name?" "Grace. Grace Voss." Something shifted in Kale's expression at that, faint enough that Mira almost missed it, gone before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "Do you have anything of hers? Any belongings, letters, anything she left behind?" Mira hesitated. The locket. She had never shown it to anyone, had never even opened the small compartment on its back, because the carved symbols inside meant nothing to her, and she had long ago stopped hoping they ever would. But something about the quiet urgency in Kale's question made lying feel dangerous in a way it never had before. "A locket," she admitted. "I've had it since she died. There's something carved inside it, but I don't know what it means." "May I see it?" She pulled the thin chain from beneath her collar, the locket small and tarnished silver, worn smooth from years of being turned over anxious fingers. Baelor's ears pricked forward the instant it came into view, his entire body going rigid with an attention that made even the elders lean back in their seats. Kale took the locket carefully, turning it over in his palm before opening the back compartment. Inside, faint but still legible after all these years, was a short phrase carved in an old script Mira had never been able to read. Kale went very still. "Where did you learn to read that?" Edwin asked, his voice suddenly tight. "I have studied the old records more thoroughly than most," Kale said, though his eyes had not left the locket. "This is not common script. This is wolf tongue, the old form, the kind used only in bonding ceremonies before the histories were rewritten a generation ago." "Bonding ceremonies for whom?" Edwin demanded. Kale looked up, and when his eyes found Mira's, there was something in them that unsettled her more than anger would have, more than suspicion would have. It looked, unmistakably, like recognition. "For the moon-marked line," he said quietly, "a bloodline of war beast keepers that the council erased from every official record after the war, 3 generations back. I was taught they died out entirely. Every one of them." The chamber fell into a silence, heavier than the one in the courtyard had been. "That's impossible," Edwin said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "The moon-marked line was ended deliberately. There is no possibility that—" There is a possibility standing right in front of you, Kale said, with a war beast bowed at her feet, who has never once, in 30 years, disobeyed me. Mira felt the room tilt slightly, or perhaps it was only her own head spinning. I don't understand any of this. My mother never told me anything. I don't know what a bonding ceremony is. I don't know what the moon-marked line is. I don't know why any of this is happening to me. Show me your wrist, Kale said, gently now, though the command beneath the gentleness remained unmistakable. Slowly, Mira pulled back her sleeve, revealing the mark she had spent her entire life hiding, the crescent moon wrapped in thorns, dark as old ink against her skin. The chamber went utterly silent again, and this time even Edwin had nothing to say. That confirms it, Kale said, almost to himself. The mark only appears on true descendants of the bonded line. I have only ever seen it drawn in the old texts. I never expected to see it on skin. What does it mean for me? Mira asked, and there was real fear in the question now. Fear that had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with the sudden, terrifying weight of being someone rather than no one. Kale was quiet for a long moment before he answered. It means you are not who anyone in this hall believed you to be this morning, and it means that whatever quiet life you were living ends today, whether either of us wanted that or not. Baelor pressed his massive head gently against Mira's knee. The closest thing to comfort a creature like him seemed capable of offering, and for the first time since the courtyard, Mira allowed herself to feel the full weight of how frightened she truly was. Edwin rose from his seat, composure returning to his face in a way that felt calculated rather than genuine. This changes matters considerably, Alpha King. A living heir to a bloodline the Council spent considerable effort erasing is not simply a curiosity. There will be those who see this as a threat rather than a discovery. Who specifically do you mean by that? Kale asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Edwin did not respond directly, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the chamber door, and Mira followed his gaze to find a man standing in the entrance she had not noticed arrive. Tall, well-dressed in the deep green of Ashveil's ruling family, with pale eyes that studied her the way a merchant studies goods before deciding whether they are worth purchasing or worth destroying. Corwin, Kale said, his voice carrying an edge Mira had not heard from him before. I was not aware you had returned from the eastern border. News travels quickly when a war beast humiliates itself before a servant girl in front of the entire pack, Corwin said smoothly, stepping into the chamber as though he owned it, which, Mira realized with a sinking feeling, in some sense he very well might, given whatever claim he held to Ashveil's leadership. I came to see the spectacle for myself. His pale eyes settled on Mira, and something in his expression made the small hairs along her arms rise. A moon-marked heir, he said slowly, tasting the words. How remarkably inconvenient for certain arrangements that were, until this morning, considered quite settled. Careful, Corwin, Kale said. I am always careful, cousin. Corwin's smile did not reach his eyes. It is others who tend to be careless, particularly when unexpected heirs appear from nowhere with stories nobody can verify. Mira felt Baelor's body tense beside her, a low sound building somewhere deep in his chest that was not quite a growl, but carried the same warning weight. I have said nothing that requires verification, Mira said, forcing steadiness into her voice she did not entirely feel. I did not ask for any of this. I do not want any of this. And yet you have it, Corwin said, whether you wanted it or not. That is often how inheritance works. He turned and left the chamber as smoothly as he had entered it, and the silence he left behind felt sharper than any argument could have, a silence full of things that had not been said but had nonetheless been clearly understood by everyone present. Kale watched the door for a long moment after Corwin had gone, before turning back to Mira, his expression carefully composed once more, though Mira had seen enough now to recognize the effort it took him to keep it that way. You will stay in the guest quarters tonight, he said, under guard, for your own protection, not as a prisoner. That is not necessary, Edwin began. It is entirely necessary, Kale said, cutting him off without raising his voice, and something about the finality of it ended the discussion completely. A council session has been called for tomorrow. Until then, nothing further will be decided about her, and no one, his gaze swept the chamber deliberately, will act against her without my direct knowledge. Mira rose on legs that still did not feel entirely her own, clutching Elena's bread and the reopened locket in shaking hands. Baelor rose with her, refusing, as he had refused all afternoon, to be more than a single step away. As the guards led her from the chamber, she caught Kale's eyes one final time and found in them something she had not expected to find, something that looked less like the measured calculation of a king assessing a political problem, and more like a man watching a truth he had never anticipated slowly reorganize the entire shape of his world. The guest quarters were finer than anything Mira had ever slept in, a bed with real blankets instead of a thin cot, a fireplace already lit against the evening chill. None of it comforted her. Baelor lay across the doorway like a living barricade, refusing every attempt by the guards to separate him from her, until eventually they gave up trying and simply posted themselves further down the corridor instead. Mira sat on the edge of the bed, turning the locket over in her fingers, staring at the carved phrase she still could not read but now understood carried weight enough to rewrite her entire life in a single afternoon. Moon-marked, she murmured to herself, testing the shape of the words. What does that even mean for me now? Baelor lifted his massive head at the sound of her voice, gray eyes steady and patient, the same eyes that had watched empires rise and fall long before Mira had been born. He said nothing, of course, because he could not speak, but something in his stillness felt like an answer regardless, or at least like the promise that whatever came next, she would not face it entirely alone. Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps approaching. Every shift of wind against the windows sounded like a threat gathering itself in the dark. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, she had barely closed her eyes at all. A soft knock came at the door before the sun had fully risen. Mira opened it to find Kale Draven standing in the corridor, alone, without guards, dressed more plainly than she had seen him the day before, as though he had come not as a king, but simply as a man who had also not slept. "May I come in?" he asked. Baelor shifted from the doorway without complaint, allowing him through, which Mira understood by now meant something significant, given how the beast had treated every other approach the previous day. "I wanted to speak with you before the council session," Kale said, once the door had closed behind him, without an audience deciding what either of us is allowed to say. Mira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her sleeping dress was, how unprepared she felt for a conversation with the most powerful man in the northern packs. "What is there to say? You said yourself, I'm the last of some bloodline nobody thought existed anymore. What happens to a girl like that?" Kale was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Historically, the moon-marked line served alongside the ruling bloodline, not beneath it. Their bond with the war beasts made them essential during times of conflict. The council erased them from the records because a bloodline capable of commanding creatures like Baelor represented a threat to absolute authority, not because they had done anything wrong. "So I'm dangerous simply by existing." "You are inconvenient by existing," Kale corrected. "Dangerous is a different question, and one I do not yet have an answer for, though I suspect the answer has more to do with what others choose to do with your existence than anything you would choose to do yourself." "Corwin," Mira said. Something tightened at the corner of Kale's mouth. "Corwin has spent the better part of 2 years positioning himself as my successor, should anything happen to me before I have named an heir of my own. A living moon-marked descendant complicates that positioning considerably, particularly given how visibly Baelor has already declared his loyalty." "I never asked for his loyalty," Mira said. "I never asked for any of this. Yesterday morning I was scrubbing floors. Today I'm apparently the reason a war beast broke 30 years of discipline in front of the entire pack." "I know." Kale's voice softened slightly. "For whatever it is worth, I do not believe you engineered any of this. Baelor's loyalty cannot be bought, commanded, or manipulated. What happened yesterday was real, whether either of us understands why yet. Mira studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the political calculation she had expected to find there, the same calculation she had seen so plainly in Corwin's pale eyes the previous evening. She did not find it. What she found instead looked almost like honesty, uncomfortable and unpracticed, as though Cale Draven was not entirely used to speaking without the armor of his position wrapped around every word. "What happens now?" she asked. "The council will want answers I don't yet have. Edwin will push for you to be sent away, quietly, before your existence becomes a wider political problem. Corwin will push for something considerably less quiet, if given the opportunity." The plainness of that statement landed harder than any softened version might have. "You mean he would hurt me?" "I mean I do not intend to give him the opportunity to find out," Cale said, and there was something final in his tone that Mira found she believed completely. A horn sounded somewhere outside, low and urgent, cutting through the quiet morning. Cale's head turned toward the window instantly, his entire posture shifting into something sharper, more alert. "That is not the tribute horn," he said. Baelor was already on his feet, a low growl building deep in his chest, his attention fixed on the door. "What is it?" Mira asked, her heart climbing into her throat. "A perimeter warning," Cale said, already moving toward the door. "Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me." Wait. But he was already gone, and the door had barely closed behind him before shouting erupted somewhere in the courtyard below, distant at first, then closer, boots pounding against stone, voices raised in alarm that Mira could not fully make out through the thick walls. Baelor paced the length of the room, ears pinned forward, every muscle in his massive body coiled with tension. Mira pressed herself against the wall beside the window, peering carefully through the gap in the curtains, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Fire. Not a large blaze, but enough to send smoke curling up from the direction of the stables, and figures moving through the chaos in dark cloaks that did not belong to any of Ashveil's own guards. The door burst open without a knock, and Mira spun, heart hammering, half expecting Corwin's pale eyes to be waiting for her. Instead it was Elena, breathless, her face pale with fear. "They're saying it's a raid," Elena gasped. "Someone set the stables alight to draw the guards away from the hall. Nobody knows who yet, but—" She hesitated, glancing at Mira with an expression that made the unspoken accusation painfully clear. Everyone already suspected exactly who might benefit from chaos striking on this particular morning. "Where is Cale?" Mira asked, directing the guards toward the fire. "I came to get you out of here, in case." She did not finish the sentence, because the door frame beside her splintered as something heavy struck it from the corridor outside, and a masked figure shouldered his way into the room before either woman could react. Baelor moved faster than Mira's eyes could fully track, a wall of gray fury closing the distance in a single leap, and the intruder barely had time to raise his weapon before Baelor's weight slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. The man did not rise again. Elena screamed. Mira froze, every instinct in her body seizing up at once, the sound of the impact still ringing in her ears. "Out," Elena finally managed, dragging Mira toward the far door that led to the servants' passage, a narrow corridor Mira knew well from years of carrying trays through it unseen. Now, before more of them come. They ran. Baelor followed at Mira's heel, blood on his fur that was not his own, his gray eyes scanning every shadow for the next threat before it could fully form. The passage was tight and dark, lit only by narrow slits of morning light, and Mira's bare feet slapped painfully against the cold stone as she ran. They emerged into a side courtyard just as three more cloaked figures rounded the corner ahead of them, weapons already drawn, clearly having anticipated exactly this escape route. "Behind me," Elena said, though her voice shook with the futility of the instruction, an unarmed kitchen woman offering to shield anyone from armed attackers. Baelor did not wait for instructions. He surged forward, and the courtyard filled with the sound of a fight that Mira could barely bring herself to watch, snarling and shouting, and the wet, awful sounds of a battle that ended far more quickly than she expected. 3 trained fighters, no true match for a creature that had survived 30 years of far worse. When it was over, Baelor stood breathing hard amid the fallen, his fur matted dark in several places, and Mira realized with a jolt of horror that some of that darkness was blood that was, this time, his own. "You're hurt," she said, rushing forward before caution could stop her, pressing her hands against a gash along his shoulder that looked deep enough to worry her badly. Baelor huffed, an almost dismissive sound, and nudged her hands aside gently, more concerned with scanning the courtyard for further threats than with his own injury. Footsteps approached from the main courtyard, and Mira's entire body tensed until she recognized Kale's voice calling her name, raw with an urgency she had not heard from him before. He rounded the corner and stopped short at the sight before him, the fallen attackers, Baelor's injury, Mira kneeling in the dirt with her hands still pressed against his fur. "Are you hurt?" he asked, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands hovering as though he wanted to check her himself, but was not entirely certain he had the right to. "I'm fine," Mira said, though her voice shook enough to undercut the claim slightly. "Baelor isn't. They came for me, didn't they? Not for the stables." Kale's jaw tightened. The stables were a distraction. Someone wanted the guards scattered long enough to reach you before I could stop them. "Corwin," Mira said, and it was not a question. "I have no proof of that yet," Kale said, though the tightness in his voice suggested he suspected it every bit as strongly as she did. "But I intend to get it." He crouched down beside Baelor, examining the wound with the careful hands of someone who had tended this particular beast's injuries many times before. "This needs proper attention. Both of you need to be somewhere secure, immediately, not standing exposed in a courtyard where I clearly cannot guarantee your safety." They moved quickly after that, Kale half supporting Baelor's weight while barking orders to the guards who finally arrived, securing the perimeter, sending riders to check every gate, questioning every servant who might have seen the attackers arrive. Elena stayed close to Mira throughout, refusing to be sent away despite Kale's insistence that she return to the safety of the main hall. By the time they reached the private wing reserved for the Alpha King's own quarters, well guarded and considerably more defensible than the guest rooms, Mira's hands had finally stopped shaking, replaced by a numbness that felt almost worse. A healer arrived to tend Baelor's wound, while Kale paced the length of the room, his composure from that morning entirely gone now, replaced by something closer to barely restrained anger. "I should have anticipated this," he said, more to himself than to her. "The moment word spread of what happened in the courtyard, I should have known someone would move quickly, before public opinion had time to settle in your favor." "Public opinion doesn't matter to me right now," Mira said. "Someone just tried to have me killed." "I know." He stopped pacing, finally looking at her directly, and the anger in his expression softened into something rawer, something closer to the fear he had clearly been suppressing since the horn first sounded. "And I am the one who told you to stay in a room I could not adequately protect. That failure is mine. You couldn't have known." "I should have known," he said, his voice tight. "Baelor's bond to you means an attack on you is an attack on him, and an attack on him has never once, in 30 years, gone unanswered. Whoever ordered this either did not understand that risk, or understood it perfectly and decided you were worth it regardless." The healer finished wrapping Baelor's shoulder, and the great beast settled with a low, tired sigh onto the floor beside Mira's chair, close enough that she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breathing against her leg. She found herself resting a hand against his fur without entirely deciding to, drawing comfort from the warmth and solidity of him in a way she had not expected a war beast to provide. "Thank you," she said quietly to Baelor, though Kale was the one who answered. "He would not accept thanks even if he understood the concept," Kale said, a faint, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth for the first time since the attack. He simply does what loyalty requires. It has never once occurred to him to expect gratitude for it. Mira studied the beast beside her, this creature the histories described as unbondable, unreachable, loyal to exactly one soul in the entire world for 30 unbroken years, and felt something complicated settle in her chest, gratitude tangled with fear, tangled with a confusion she did not yet have words for. "Why me?" she asked, not entirely certain whether the question was meant for Kale, for Baelor, or simply for whatever unseen forces had arranged her mother's silence and her own hidden mark into this particular, terrifying morning. Kale did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost uncertain, an unfamiliar register for a man who commanded an entire pack without ever needing to raise his voice. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out, and I intend to make certain you survive long enough to learn the answer yourself." Outside, the smoke from the stables had finally begun to clear, but Mira understood, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, that whatever quiet, invisible life she had once lived was gone entirely now, burned away as thoroughly as the stable roof, and there would be no returning to it, no matter how badly some frightened part of her still wished there could be. The council session that had been promised for that morning was delayed by the attack, and by the time the elders finally gathered that afternoon, the mood in the chamber had shifted considerably from suspicion into something closer to genuine alarm. An attack within Ashveil's own walls, against a girl now publicly connected to Baelor, was not a matter any of them could dismiss as a minor irregularity anymore. Mira sat at the same chair as the day before, though this time Kale sat closer, near enough that she could feel the tension radiating from him whenever Edwin spoke, and near enough that Baelor, still favoring his wounded shoulder slightly, chose to lie across both their feet rather than just her own. "The attackers have been identified as mercenaries, hired through intermediaries in the eastern border towns," Kale said, addressing the full council without preamble. "Preliminary questioning of the one survivor suggests the contract was arranged no more than 2 days ago." 2 days, Edwin repeated, before the tribute ceremony even occurred. "Before Baelor's display in the courtyard." "Yes," Kale confirmed, and Mira felt the implication land across the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. "Which means whoever arranged this attack already knew who Mira Voss was before the rest of us did." Every eye in the chamber turned, inevitably, toward the empty seat that should have belonged to Corwin, who had conveniently absented himself from the session entirely. "That is a serious accusation to leave unspoken," one of the younger elders said carefully. "I have made no accusation," Kale said. "I have stated a fact. The council may draw its own conclusions, though I suspect most of you have already drawn them." Edwin's expression tightened, caught between his usual instinct to dismiss anything inconvenient and the obvious difficulty of dismissing an assassination attempt that had occurred within Ashveil's own walls. Regardless of who arranged the attack, the underlying problem remains. A living moon-marked heir represents a destabilizing element to the current order, whether or not she asked for the role. "The current order nearly got her killed this morning, through no fault of her own," Kale said, an edge entering his voice that made even Edwin pause. "I am considerably more concerned with correcting that failure than with preserving whatever comfortable arrangement the council has grown accustomed to." "And what would you propose instead?" Edwin asked. Kale was quiet for a moment, and Mira felt her pulse quicken, uncertain what answer he intended to give, uncertain what answer she even wanted him to give. "Formal protection, under my direct authority, until the full extent of her lineage and its implications can be properly determined," Kale said finally. "Not confinement, not exile, protection." Murmurs spread around the table, some clearly displeased, others considering the proposal, with the careful calculation of people recalculating which side of a shifting situation might prove safer to stand on. "That arrangement grants her considerable proximity to the throne," Edwin said carefully. "Some might view that as its own kind of destabilization." "Some might," Kale agreed, "and I would remind the council that Baelor's loyalty is not a political maneuver I orchestrated for convenience. It occurred entirely outside my control, in front of every person in that courtyard. If the council wishes to argue with 30 years of established loyalty suddenly redirecting itself, I invite you to take that argument up with Baelor directly." A ripple of uneasy laughter broke the tension slightly, though Edwin did not look amused. The council debated for another hour, circling arguments Mira only partially followed, old grievances and older fears surfacing beneath every carefully worded objection. Eventually, worn down by Cale's patient insistence and the undeniable fact of the morning's attack, the council granted the arrangement, though not without conditions attached: restrictions on Mira's movement, requirements for regular reporting, a dozen small compromises that made clear the elders had not fully accepted her presence so much as tolerated it under pressure. When the session finally ended, Mira felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, the particular tiredness of having spent hours being discussed as though she were a problem to be solved rather than a person in the room. Cale walked with her afterward through the quieter corridors of the private wing, Baelor limping slightly between them, and for a long while neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable in a way Mira had not expected it to be after the tension of the chamber. "Thank you," she finally said, "for what you said in there, about Baelor's loyalty not being something you arranged." "It was the truth," Cale said simply. "I would not have needed to argue it if it were not." "Edwin doesn't trust me. Edwin does not trust anything that threatens the order he has spent his life maintaining," Cale said. "It is not entirely about you, though I understand it feels that way, being the subject of that particular suspicion." They stopped near a window overlooking the courtyard where the attack had begun that morning, the scorched section of the stable roof still visible in the fading afternoon light, workers already beginning repairs. "Can I ask you something?" Mira said. "Of course. Why did you argue for me in there? You barely know me. Yesterday morning you didn't know I existed. Today, you're risking the council's trust to protect a servant girl nobody would have missed if Corwin's men had succeeded this morning." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the courtyard below rather than on her, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a careful honesty that felt harder for him to produce than any of the political arguments he had made in the chamber. "Because Baelor has never once been wrong about anyone in 30 years, he said. "He judged men I trusted completely and found them wanting before I ever discovered the reasons why. He judged men I distrusted and proved eventually that my distrust was misplaced. I have learned, over 3 decades, to weigh his instincts as heavily as my own, sometimes more heavily. When he knelt before you in that courtyard, it was not simply strange behavior from an old beast. It was the clearest signal I have ever received about anything." "And what did that signal tell you?" "That you matter," Cale said simply, "in ways I do not yet fully understand, but in ways I am not willing to dismiss, simply because they are inconvenient for the council's comfort." Mira felt something warm move through her chest that had nothing to do with fear, an unfamiliar sensation after a day that had contained so much of it, and she was not entirely certain what to do with it, so she said nothing at all, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them instead. Baelor, sensing perhaps that the tension of the day had finally eased slightly, settled onto the floor beside the window, with a contented huff, resting his great head against Mira's foot, as though claiming a small piece of territory he intended to defend regardless of what the council decided in any chamber. "He likes you," Cale observed, a faint smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "He knelt before I even had the chance to be liked," Mira pointed out. "That too," Cale agreed, though I suspect the liking came rather quickly afterward. They stood together at the window a while longer, watching the workers repair the stable roof below, and for the first time since the horns had sounded that morning, Mira allowed herself a single, careful breath of something close to safety. It did not last. A guard appeared at the end of the corridor, breathless, his expression carrying the particular urgency Mira had already learned to dread. "Alpha King, there is a matter requiring your attention. Lord Corwin has returned to the compound and is requesting an audience. claiming he has evidence relevant to this morning's attack. Cale's expression hardened instantly, the warmth from moments before folding away behind the careful mask Mira had first seen in the council chamber. Evidence, or theater designed to redirect suspicion elsewhere. He was insistent, Alpha King. Cale glanced at Mira, weighing something silently before speaking again. Come with me. If Corwin intends to make claims about this morning's attack, I want you present to hear them directly, rather than filtered through whatever version reaches you afterward. They found Corwin waiting in a smaller receiving room near the main hall, composed and unhurried despite the chaos that had gripped the compound only hours earlier, as though the morning's violence had inconvenienced his schedule rather than threatened anyone's life. "Cousin," Cale said, his tone carefully neutral, "I understand you have evidence regarding this morning's attack." "I have concerns," Corwin corrected smoothly, "which I believe warrant careful consideration before the council commits itself further to a certain arrangement." His pale eyes flicked toward Mira, lingering just long enough to make his meaning unmistakable. "Speak plainly, Corwin. I have little patience remaining today for careful phrasing." Corwin's smile did not waver. "I have received word from contacts along the eastern border that the mercenaries responsible for this morning's attack were, in fact, hired to eliminate a specific threat to Ashveil's stability, a threat identified well before the tribute ceremony occurred." He paused deliberately. "Which raises the question of who, precisely, recognized that threat early enough to arrange such measures, and why. You are suggesting someone within Ashveil orchestrated an attack against a girl before she had even been publicly identified," Cale said slowly, "in order to eliminate a threat that had not yet manifested." "I am suggesting," Corwin said, "that perhaps the attack was never truly aimed at eliminating her at all, but rather at exposing her, forcing precisely the situation we find ourselves in now, an heir conveniently protected under your direct authority, conveniently positioned close to the throne, conveniently sympathetic given this morning's violence." The implication settled over the room like a slow, spreading chill. Mira felt her stomach drop as she understood what Corwin was suggesting, not that someone had tried to kill her, but that the entire attack had been staged, orchestrated to manufacture exactly the sympathy and protection she now enjoyed. "That is a considerable accusation," Cale said, his voice dangerously quiet now, particularly given that Baelor sustained a genuine injury protecting her this morning. "Beasts can be injured for many reasons," Corwin said. "Convenience does not require perfection, only sufficient plausibility." "Are you accusing me of arranging an attack on myself?" Mira finally spoke, her voice shaking with an anger that surprised even her. "Of orchestrating my own near death to gain sympathy I never asked for in the first place." "I am accusing no one specifically," Corwin said, his composure unshaken. "I am merely suggesting the council consider all possibilities before granting formal protection and proximity to power, based on a single, dramatic morning." "The council has already granted the arrangement," Cale said flatly. "This afternoon, after full deliberation." Something flickered across Corwin's expression, brief and quickly suppressed, but Mira caught it clearly enough, a flash of genuine displeasure that suggested his theory had been intended to prevent precisely the outcome that had already occurred without his knowledge. "Then I suppose the matter is settled," Corwin said, recovering his smoothness with practiced ease. "Though I would encourage continued vigilance, cousin. Convenient narratives have a way of unraveling eventually, regardless of how thoroughly they are initially believed." He left the room with the same unhurried confidence with which he had entered it, and Mira found herself trembling slightly once the door closed behind him, not from fear this time, but from the particular exhaustion of having been accused, subtly and without direct evidence, of engineering her own attempted murder. "He's trying to turn the council against me before they've even had time to fully accept me," she said. "Yes," Cale agreed grimly, "and he very nearly succeeded in planting sufficient doubt to do exactly that, had the council's decision not already been finalized." "What happens now?" "Now," Cale said, his jaw tight, "I intend to determine exactly what Corwin knew, and when he knew it, because a man that quick to accuse others of staging convenient narratives is often the man most familiar with staging them himself. Baelor, who had remained silent and watchful throughout the entire exchange, let out a low growl as the sound of Corwin's retreating footsteps faded down the corridor, an unmistakable judgment delivered without a single word required. "He agrees with you," Mira observed quietly. "He agreed with me before either of us spoke a single word," Kale said. "I have learned, by now, to trust that instinct above almost anything else." Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the mountains, painting the scorched stable roof in shades of gold that almost, but not quite, disguised the violence of the morning beneath a deceptively peaceful glow. Mira watched it settle, aware with growing certainty that whatever quiet resolution she had hoped this day might bring, the danger surrounding her had not lessened at all. It had simply grown more careful about how it chose to show itself. 3 days passed before Kale found what he was looking for. 3 days in which Mira learned to live under the constant watch of guards. 3 days in which she barely left the private wing except for careful, escorted walks through gardens she had once only glimpsed from the servants' passage while carrying trays. Baelor never left her side during any of it, his shoulder healing steadily, his gray eyes tracking every stranger who came within 20 paces of her, with a wariness that had not existed before the attack. Elena visited when she could, bringing news from the kitchens along with whatever food she could smuggle past the guards, though the guards had grown lenient enough with her by the second day that smuggling hardly felt necessary anymore. "The whole compound is talking about nothing else," Elena reported on the third evening, settling into the chair beside Mira's window with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had spent her whole life gathering information nobody expected her to notice. "Half of them think you're some kind of miracle. The other half think Lord Corwin is planning something considerably worse than accusations." "Which half do you think is right?" Mira asked. "Both, probably," Elena said. "Miracles and danger tend to travel together more often than people expect." On the fourth morning, Kale arrived at her door earlier than usual, his expression carrying a tightness that told Mira immediately something significant had happened. "I found the intermediary who arranged the mercenary contract," he said, without preamble. "A merchant trading along the eastern border, well known for handling transactions that require considerable discretion. And he was reluctant to speak at first, considerably less reluctant once presented with the alternative of explaining his silence to a war beast rather than to me." Despite everything, Mira felt a faint, unexpected smile tug at her mouth. "Baelor helped with the questioning?" "Baelor merely stood in the room," Kale said, the faintest trace of dark humor entering his voice. His presence proved sufficiently persuasive on its own. "What did the merchant say?" Kale's humor faded quickly. "The contract was arranged by an agent working directly for Corwin. Payment traced back through 3 intermediaries, but traced back regardless. Clearly enough that even the council cannot dismiss it as coincidence or fabrication." Mira felt something settle in her chest, not relief exactly, but a grim satisfaction at finally having proof rather than suspicion. "So he did try to have me killed." "It appears so," Kale said, "though I suspect, given his accusations afterward, that his intention was somewhat more complicated than simple elimination. I believe he intended the attack to fail, or at least to appear to fail dramatically enough that he could later claim the entire event had been staged for sympathy, precisely the argument he attempted in that receiving room." "He wanted it both ways," Mira said slowly, working through the logic. "If the attack succeeded, the problem was eliminated cleanly. If it failed, he had already prepared the argument that would turn the failure against me instead of against him." "Precisely," Kale said. "A carefully constructed arrangement, regardless of outcome. Unfortunately for him, he did not anticipate how thoroughly Baelor's protection would complicate either scenario, nor how quickly the council would move to formalize your protection before his counter-narrative had time to take root." "What happens to him now?" Kale's jaw tightened. "The council convenes this afternoon. I intend to present the evidence formally, in front of every elder, including those who have been most reluctant to accept your presence here." Mira felt her pulse quicken with an anxiety that had nothing to do with fear for her own safety this time, and everything to do with the weight of what such a confrontation might mean, for Kale, for the pack, for a political order that had apparently been quietly unstable for far longer than she had realized. "Will he simply accept the accusation?" she asked. "Or will he fight it? Corwin has never simply accepted anything in his life," Kale said grimly. "I expect him to fight it with everything available to him. Which means, unfortunately, that today may prove considerably more dangerous than the morning of the attack itself." The council chamber felt different that afternoon, charged with an anticipation that Mira could feel pressing against her skin the moment she entered. Every elder was present this time, along with several senior warriors Mira had not seen in previous sessions, their expressions carefully neutral in the particular way of people who suspected violence might erupt before the day's business concluded. Corwin arrived precisely on time, composed as always, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he had anticipated exactly what this session intended to address. Kale did not waste time on preamble. He laid out the evidence methodically, the merchant's testimony, the traced payments, the timeline that placed the contract's arrangement well before the tribute ceremony had even occurred, and the chamber grew progressively quieter as the weight of the evidence accumulated, elder after elder abandoning whatever polite skepticism they had entered with. "This is fabrication," Corwin said, once Kale had finished, though his voice lacked the smooth confidence Mira had grown accustomed to hearing from him. "A merchant, desperate to avoid punishment for his own crimes, will say whatever is required to redirect blame elsewhere. The payments traced to your personal accounts, Corwin," Kale said, "not to some ambiguous account that might belong to anyone with sufficient imagination, yours specifically. Accounts can be manipulated, records can be falsified." "By whom?" Edwin asked, and Mira turned in surprise, having expected the old elder to remain one of Corwin's more reliable allies throughout this confrontation. "I have reviewed the evidence myself, Corwin, independently of the Alpha King's presentation. I found nothing that suggests fabrication, and considerable detail that suggests the opposite." Corwin's composure finally cracked, something raw and furious flashing across his pale eyes before he managed to smooth it back into place. "Even if the accusation holds merit, consider what is truly at stake here: an unknown girl, appearing from nowhere, suddenly commanding the loyalty of the most powerful war beast in the northern packs, positioned now at the very center of power through nothing more than an old bloodline and an animal's inexplicable behavior. Is that truly less dangerous to this pack's stability than the actions you accuse me of?" "The actions I accuse you of nearly resulted in her death," Kale said, his voice dangerously quiet now, carrying a weight that made even the senior warriors shift uneasily in their seats. "Regardless of whatever danger you imagine her bloodline might eventually represent, you chose to answer that imagined danger with an assassin's blade against an innocent girl who had done nothing beyond existing. That is not political maneuvering, Corwin. That is murder, attempted against someone who never harmed you, never threatened you, and never asked for any part of the position you now claim justified your actions." Foucault. The chamber fell silent, the full weight of Kale's words settling over every person present. Mira felt Baelor press closer against her leg, a low, steady rumble building in his chest, not quite a growl, but a clear signal of the judgment he had rendered the moment Corwin entered the room. Edwin rose slowly from his seat, his expression grave. "The council will need to deliberate on appropriate consequences, but I will state plainly, for the record, that attempted murder within Ashveil's own walls, against any resident regardless of bloodline, cannot go unanswered without undermining every principle this pack claims to uphold." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table, and Mira watched Corwin's expression shift from fury into something colder, more calculating, the look of a man recognizing that the room had turned against him decisively enough that no further argument would recover his position. "This is not finished," Corwin said quietly, more to Kale than to the assembled council, before turning and walking from the chamber with the guards Kale had stationed at the doors, falling into step behind him, no longer an honor guard, but something considerably closer to custody. The chamber remained tense for a long moment after his departure, before Edwin finally spoke again. The council formally acknowledges Mira Voss as a legitimate descendant of the moon-marked line, and grants her the protections and recognitions historically afforded that bloodline, effective immediately. Mira felt the words land with a strange, disorienting weight, an entire identity granted to her in a single sentence after a lifetime of having none at all. The session concluded shortly afterward, the elders dispersing in quiet clusters, their expressions ranging from cautious acceptance to lingering unease, though none of them, Mira noted, looked at her with the open hostility Edwin had carried during their first meeting. Kale found her in the corridor afterward, Baelor pacing contentedly beside her now that the tension of the confrontation had finally eased. "It's over," Mira said, though the words felt strange in her mouth, uncertain whether she entirely believed them. "Corwin's immediate threat is over," Kale corrected gently. "The larger questions about what your bloodline means, about what role you might choose to play in Ashveil going forward, those remain very much unresolved. What do you think I should do?" Mira asked. Kale considered the question carefully before answering. "I think that is not a decision I am entitled to make for you. You spent your entire life having decisions made about you by people who never bothered asking what you actually wanted. I do not intend to become another one of those people." Something in his words struck her deeply, a recognition of exactly the invisibility she had lived within for so long, offered back to her not as pity, but as genuine respect for whatever choice she made next. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "A week ago, I was scrubbing floors and hoping nobody would notice me. Now apparently I'm the last heir of a bloodline, important enough that someone tried to have me killed over it. I haven't had time to want anything beyond simply surviving each day as it comes." "That is fair," Kale said. "There is no requirement that you decide anything today, or tomorrow, or any specific day at all. Whatever time you need to understand what this means for you, you will have it." They walked together through the gardens as the afternoon light softened toward evening, Baelor trailing behind them at a comfortable distance, no longer needing to press quite so close, now that the immediate danger had passed, though he remained, as he always would, within reach. "Can I ask you something else?" Mira said, as they paused beside a fountain she had once glimpsed only from a distance while carrying trays through the servants' passage. "Of course. That first day, in the courtyard, before you knew anything about the moon-marked line, before the locket, before any of it, what did you feel, watching Baelor kneel in front of a servant girl he had never met?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful honesty he had brought to every difficult conversation between them since that morning. "Unsettled," he admitted finally. "I had spent 30 years believing Baelor's loyalty belonged entirely to me, earned through years of bond and trust that I assumed no one else could ever challenge. Watching him kneel before someone else, without hesitation, without any command from me, forced me to recognize how much of my own certainty about the world had been built on an assumption I never thought to question." "And now?" "Now," Kale said, watching her carefully, "I find myself considerably less certain about a great many things I once took for granted, and considerably more curious about a girl who seems to inspire loyalty of that magnitude without ever once asking for it." Mira felt warmth rise in her cheeks, unfamiliar and slightly overwhelming after a week that had contained so much fear and uncertainty. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, letting the silence between them carry whatever meaning it wanted to carry. Baelor, sensing the shift in the air between them perhaps more clearly than either of them did themselves, settled onto the grass beside the fountain with a contented sigh, resting his great head on his paws, watching the two of them with ancient, patient eyes that had, after 30 years of unwavering loyalty to one soul, finally found reason to extend that loyalty toward another. That evening, as the sun finally set behind the mountains, Ashveil's compound settled into a quiet, that felt different from the fear that had gripped it days earlier, a quiet built on resolution rather than dread. Word of Corwin's exposure and the council's formal acknowledgement had spread quickly through every corner of the pack, and where once servants had stepped around Mira without a glance, they now offered careful nods of respect, still uncertain how to address a girl who had risen so suddenly from invisibility into significance, but no longer treating her as though she did not exist at all. Elena found her that night in the gardens, settling onto the bench beside her with the particular weariness of a woman who had spent the entire day managing kitchen gossip on top of her usual duties. "You look different," Elena observed, studying Mira's face in the fading light. "I don't feel very different," Mira admitted, "still frightened most of the time, if I'm honest." "That's not what I meant," Elena said. "You look like someone who finally believes she's allowed to take up space in the world, rather than someone constantly apologizing for existing in it." Mira considered that for a long moment, turning the locket over in her fingers, the carved phrase inside it no longer a mystery but a truth she was still learning to carry. "Maybe that's fair." "It's more than fair," Elena said. "It's about time." Later, as the compound settled fully into night, Mira stood once more at the window of her new quarters, considerably finer than anything she had ever occupied before, watching the stars gather over the mountains that had watched Ashveil's history unfold for generations longer than any single life could measure. Baelor lay curled at the foot of her bed, his breathing slow and steady, healed enough now that his earlier limp had all but disappeared. She thought of her mother, of the silence she had carried for so many years, of the locket passed down not as sentiment but as inheritance, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal what it had always contained. She thought of the courtyard, of the silence that had fallen over 300 people the instant Baelor bowed before her, a silence that had felt, at the time, like the end of everything safe in her life, but which she now understood, standing here in the quiet aftermath, had actually been the beginning of everything else. A soft knock came at her door, and she opened it to find Kale standing in the corridor once more, his expression carrying none of the political weight it had held during the council session, something simpler and more genuine in its place. "I wanted to make certain you were settling in," he said, though something in his tone suggested the visit carried purpose beyond mere courtesy. "I am," Mira said, slowly. "Slowly is reasonable," Kale said, "given everything this past week has asked of you." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them, not as burden now, but as shared history, the foundation of something neither of them had expected, but neither seemed inclined to reject. "Thank you," Mira said finally, "for believing me, from the very first moment, when you had every reason not to." "Baelor believed you first," Kale said, a faint smile finally reaching his eyes. "I simply had the sense to trust his judgment." Behind them, the great beast lifted his head briefly at the sound of his name, gray eyes reflecting the moonlight, before settling back down with the deep, contented sigh of a creature who had finally found exactly where he belonged, and had, in doing so, guided his king toward the same discovery. Outside, Ashveil slept quietly beneath the mountains, its people no longer whispering in fear, but in something closer to wonder, the story of the servant girl and the war beast already beginning to settle into the pack's history, not as scandal, but as legend, the kind told for generations afterward, about the day an entire courtyard fell silent, and a poor girl's quiet life ended so that something far larger could finally begin.